you. Thank you, Terry. That was a perfect song to follow that reading. This text today, let me first apologize. I was trying to be good and I was eating an apple instead of a cheese Danish this morning. And I got a little chunk of the apple that just won't go down. So I'm having a little throat problem. So bear with me. I've got my water here. The passage today is about touch. And it's about a woman who, by the convention of that time, was denied the capacity to be touched because she's considered unclean by some. We have been through a period of time in this world and in our lives where we have been denied the capacity to touch. And we look at each other as unclean. Yeah, we didn't call it that, but you might have the virus. And I think what we've been through this year puts us in touch with cultures that have this practice, this demarcation of those who can be touched and those who cannot be touched. We've had a little bit of experience with that. At first, my first impulse was to call the sermon today, The Power of Touch. But I didn't want us to be diverted from what I really think is the heart and core of this passage. For touch is simply the means to the real deal. The real thing is power. And so the sermon is called When Women Take Power, because that's what she does in this story. We have on Wednesday nights centering prayer. We experience here in our worship just 2 minutes of the peace and the silence and the release of centering prayer. On Wednesday nights, and we gather by Zoom, we get the benefit of 20 minutes of the relief and the silence and the release, the turning away from the world, the turning inward toward the divine that is within us. So I invite you on Wednesday evenings at 6:30 to join us for centering prayer. But after our 20 minutes of silence, we have what's another practice, spiritual practice, called Lectio Divina. And that's where we read the text very slowly, we meditate on the text, and then we share how we've experienced the text. And that's the text that's going to be the scripture for the week coming. And so I say that in preparation for my rereading the text this morning. It's not that Adrian's reading was not adequate, but it is that our hearing is not adequate. And what we discover in Lectio Divina, because in Lectio Divina we read it 3 times, and every time we read it, we hear something new, we learn something new. And so that's why I like to at least repeat the part of the passage on which my sermon will focus, because we hear something new, we learn something new. So just in the 5th chapter of Mark, verses 25 to 34 is the core of the text. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Let that sink in. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. Let that sink in. Some of us have spent a lot of money trying to get well, trying to be healthy. Had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around, all around, to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." See, this is a passage about power. Yes, it involves healing, but that is simply one manifestation of power. And see, the power relations in this passage are demonstrated by the four characters in the story. Jesus is possessed of spiritual power. Then you have Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. He was endowed with earthly power. Then you have the hemorrhaging woman and the sick little girl. Now you'll notice the woman has no name, the little girl has no name. Jesus has a name, Jairus has a name. See, power is always denoted by naming. Jesus is named, he has power. Jairus is named, he has power. The hemorrhaging woman is not named. She has no power, but she is seeking power. The little girl is not named. She has no power at all. In fact, she has so little power, they thought she was dead. This is why naming is so important. It empowers one to hear your name called. Hearing your name, how many people like to hear their name? And to hear it pronounced correctly, and to see it spelled correctly. Because when people take the time to learn your name, to pronounce it correctly, they are acknowledging that you are a person that deserves the respect of having your name spoken correctly and spelled correctly. And that is a respect of your power as a person. That's why naming is so important. It brings one to life. You can be sitting there kind of slumbering or maybe just kind of not quite paying attention, and then all of a sudden, I'll say, Monica, brought it to life. I'm not saying that you were sleeping. No, I'm just saying how when you hear your name, you come to life. You come to life. It empowers you to hear your name. It means that others who use your name recognize your power, the power of your life. And that's why during Jim Crow, during days of segregation and oppression, racial oppression in this country, every black man, regardless of age, was called boy. And every black woman, regardless of age, was called gal or girl. No black person had a name that a white person needed to know. My father told me the story when he was in college, in Knoxville College in Tennessee. And they had a very benevolent white woman who would always give a job to a student as a houseboy in her home. And my father showed up at the beginning of the semester for his first day at work, and it included housing in the basement by the coal-fired stove, which was your job to heat up every morning, and a meal. And so he showed up on his first day, and she said, "What's your name, boy?" And he said, "My name is Madison Theodore Shockley." And she said, "What? That's too much name. I'll just call you Joe." And this is why the Black Lives Matter movement insists, say her name, Breonna Taylor. Say her name, Breonna Taylor. Say his name, George Floyd. Say his name, George Floyd. So the woman and the girl in the story have no names because they have no power. But the woman makes a critical, life-changing decision. She decides to take power. Jairus knew, as the leader of the synagogue, that he could walk right up to Jesus and ask him to come and heal his sick daughter. But this woman, and the scholars vary widely on this point, she did not feel that she could just come up to Jesus and ask him to lay hands on her. That's what Jairus did. He said, "Jesus, come to my house and lay hands on my daughter that she might be healed." So she, as a woman who was unclean because of this constant bleeding, could not walk up to Jesus and ask him to lay his hands on her, to heal her. She felt compelled to sneak up behind him, touch his clothes, and take power. Women have often had to take power. Power is seldom offered. Frederick Douglass says that power concedes nothing without a demand. So why did she have to sneak up on power? Was she unclean because of her constant bleeding for 12 years? It is well known, and there's no dispute about this, that in the Jewish culture of that day, that women during their menstrual cycle were considered ritually unclean and were not able to participate in the rituals of spiritual life and community. And they had to be segregated and couldn't be touched without the person touching them also becoming unclean. You see, to touch someone is to join them in their status. That's what we do when we embrace each other. It's an embrace not just of affection, but it's an embrace of that person's humanity. How many times have you heard someone who disdained another person, "Don't touch me"? Ever heard that? I know some husbands have heard that. "Don't touch me." When we are distant and angry or disregard that other person, "Don't touch me." Touch is to join someone in their status. In the Indian caste system, the slur for the lowest class, which is properly called the Dalits, they're called untouchables. Untouchables. And so this woman was an untouchable by some reckoning. And the interesting thing about touch in these purification cultures is that the upper class person or the powerful person would lose power if they touched someone lower. But the lower person would gain power if they touched someone more powerful. And they had a ritual because they didn't want these folks completely out of the culture. They still had to perform the household duties. And so the practice was, if one who was unclean, if they would wash their hands, then they could touch the other person. All she had to do was to wash her hands, and then she would be enabled to communicate the uncleanness. That connection to the uncleanness was broken by washing her hands for 20 seconds. Where have we heard that before? That if we wash our hands, then we can shake hands because we've broken the connection to our uncleanness. So, for whatever reason, she sneaks up behind Jesus and touches his clothes, and immediately power flows from Jesus to the woman, and she is healed. And Jesus, who senses that power has left him, and that's the key thing. That's what makes this passage about power. Jesus names it. It's power that left him. He demands to know who touched him. And he seeks her out, not to punish her, but he seeks her out to reward her. You see, she was afraid. She hides. But he wants to acknowledge that it wasn't her touching him that gave her power. It was her faith. It was her faith in what Jesus meant to her that gave her power. And that's what we learn from this passage today. We don't need to touch Jesus. We don't need any of those products that the televangelists are hawking on their shows. You don't need to touch their holy cloths or pour out their holy water. You don't need to touch anything. What we need is faith. We need to have faith in what Jesus means to us. This woman took power. First, she took power over her own body, and that's key here. She took power over her own body. She took power over her bleeding. And the scholars, this one particular scholar made a very important point that I want to share with you. In that culture and in this culture, in every culture that we know where patriarchy rules, we regard women's bleeding differently than men's bleeding. Even though men who die in battle and shed their blood in death is celebrated, why is it that when women bleed, which is a sign that their bodies are prepared to give life, why is that not celebrated? And so the first thing she did was to take control over her bleeding and her body. And this control is a metaphor of women's power, because women cannot get power until they first take power over their own bodies. And if they ever get power over their own bodies, then they can take power over the world. She must have power over her own body before she can take power over anything else. Women bleed each month as a sign that their bodies are ready to give birth. And we make them hide and feel shame rather than the honor that they are the life givers of this species. Because we well know that if men had to have babies, we would be extinct. I mean, I don't have a uterus, so I don't know what it feels like to be reminded that you are the vehicle and vessel of life. That should be a great thing celebrated in our culture rather than denigrated and shamed. I mean, the miracle to me is that any person decides to have a baby, that you risk your whole body, your whole life. And this is why women must have control of their own bodies. No one should make those decisions for her. In the Lectio Divina, as I was reading this passage over and over, there was one phrase that stood out to me. And it says that she felt in her body that she was healed. And so when a woman feels it in her body, what's right for her, in that moment, she is empowered to take control of her body, control of her life, and make the decisions that she alone is empowered to make. And sometimes that means risking her life to give birth, and sometimes that means terminating a pregnancy to give herself life. And not just biological life, but the life that she is called to lead and now empowered to make happen. You see, if Jesus means that all people are valuable, if that's what Jesus means to us, that all people are valuable and powerful, then we must have the faith to treat all people that way. You say, oh, that doesn't take a lot of faith. Oh, yes, it does. When you live in a culture which dishonors and denigrates certain people, and you treat those people as equals, then you are cast out of regular society, your friends, your family, because you, by communicating with them, have brought those who are forbidden into your community. Oh, yes. Just try bringing your gay or lesbian or transsexual or bisexual child or friend or lover into your family and see what happens. Just try bringing that undocumented person into your family. Just try bringing that person from another race or culture into your family and see what happens. But if you have faith that all people are equal, then it takes that faith to give you the power to live your life that way and not be afraid to do what Jesus has called you to do. If we believe that Jesus means that all people deserve power, then we have the power to make sure that every vote and every voter counts. And what Jesus ultimately told the woman is that the power was already in her. That's what he meant. Your faith. He didn't say my touch. He didn't say my power. He said your faith has made you well. Jesus was saying the power is already in you. We have the power. The power is in faith, not in Jesus or in touching Jesus. We have the power if we believe. We have the power to do miracles and to make this world a world deserving of the honor and dignity for which God, the Creator, created it. And so I say to you, go. Go in power and change the world. It's in you. Your faith will give you power. Let the people of God say, amen. And now we have a very special video that speaks a message of women's power.
Still ruling the country today, and I don't really feel like they have the right to take more than they already have from us away. This ain't about that, or has it really been all along? No, this ain't about that. If you wanna focus on right and wrong, shouldn't schools have better sexual education or contraception information for once? Only 24 states require sex ed, so more than half of US teens need a condom. The problem's abortion. Focus on what's going on, it isn't abortion. If you wanna focus on right and wrong, this is my body, this is my choice, a painful decision, but you aren't gonna steal my voice. It isn't just morals, and it's not black and white. We will govern our bodies, it's our legal right. Let's make them fight. Did you know that many think the morning after pill is an atrocity that should be banned? Maybe men should get vasectomies and get them reversed once they find a woman who'll take their hands. This ain't about that. This is all about what's legally life. It's an issue of law. It's turning into one of moral strikes. Life is an equivalent based on definition. You must account for experience. And remember that a fetus requires another body to give them their sustenance. The courts can't force us to donate organs or blood of our own. This is no exception. We can face our repercussions alone. This is my body. This is my choice. A painful decision. But you aren't gonna steal my voice. It isn't just morals, and it's not black and white. This is my body, and it's my legal right. Listen. Doctors will be scared of making any incision, which means they won't be acting on their best medical decision. Should they just make an attempt, which is not defined, they face 99 years of prison down the line. And yet let's say they don't perform because they're scared of spending time. Say the patient gets sick and sues the doctor for the crime. This all affects the healthcare system for you and me, facing higher doctors' bills to balance liability. And everybody's terrified and everybody's ill. Meanwhile, thousands could use help just getting themselves on the pill. There are way too many babies and the population's growing. We're running out of water and the rate of death is slowing. Adoptions are hard, the foster system's saturated, but an 11-year-old's birth just because she's impregnated by an uncle or rando who held her down and raped her. She was too afraid to tell, and it didn't show till 3 months later. And now she has the blessing to ruin her life and her physique, while to carry on the genes of men who violate the weak. I don't think so. For every woman who's ever had to get on her knees, stand up. For every woman who's ever had to say please, stand up. Stand up. This is my body.